On the morning of June 4, 1942, somewhere in the vast, relentless expanse of the Central Pacific Ocean, a man standing on the bridge of a wounded aircraft carrier watched the horizon burn. He had every reason to believe his ship was going to survive. The fires had been brought under control. The flooding had been checked. Damage control parties were moving through the lower decks with purpose and discipline. And the Yorktown, battered, listing, but still breathing, seemed to be defying the very mathematics of destruction. For a brief, almost miraculous moment, it looked as though she might live. And then the torpedoes came again. This is the story of a ship that refused to die quietly. A carrier that absorbed punishment that would have sent lesser vessels to the bottom in minutes. That fought back with everything she had. That gave her crew reason to believe the impossible was achievable, and then slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific anyway, carrying with her the weight of thousands of individual stories, the ghosts of battles fought in the air above her flight deck, and a set of unanswered questions that naval historians would wrestle with for decades. What happened to the USS Yorktown is not merely a story of a ship sinking. It is a story about the nature of luck, the brutality of naval warfare at its most concentrated and savage, and the extraordinary human cost of a battle that most Americans today could not accurately describe, even though it arguably saved the entire course of the war in the Pacific. How does a ship survive 2 separate torpedo attacks, 2 separate bombing runs, and still have her crew fighting aboard her, only to be finished by a single submarine lurking invisibly beneath the waves? How does something so large, so powerful, so full of human life simply vanish beneath the surface in the end? And why, for 56 years, did no one know exactly where she lay? She is down there still, resting in more than 16,000 feet of water, sitting upright on the floor of the Pacific, as though she simply decided to anchor and wait. She waited more than half a century before anyone found her. And what she witnessed in those final 2 days of her life, the scale of the carnage, the desperate courage of the men who served aboard her, and the singular tactical miracle that unfolded in the skies above, deserves to be understood in full, because it is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of naval warfare. To understand what the USS Yorktown meant, not just strategically, but emotionally, symbolically, and operationally, you have to understand the moment she was born into. She was laid down at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia on May 21, 1934, a product of the Washington Naval Treaty era, a time when naval architects were forced to perform extraordinary feats of engineering within rigid tonnage limitations that had been imposed by international agreement in 1922. She was a Yorktown-class carrier, the lead ship of her class, displacing approximately 19,800 tons at standard load and stretching 824 feet from bow to stern. Her flight deck was a broad, purposeful expanse of teak planking over steel, capable of operating roughly 90 aircraft at full wartime complement. She could push through the water at better than 32 knots when her engineering plant was running at full power, which meant she could outrun most surface threats and position herself with a speed and flexibility that fundamentally changed how naval commanders thought about carrier warfare. She was commissioned on September 30, 1937, and when she steamed into service, she represented something genuinely new in the world, not just a weapons platform, but a self-contained mobile airfield capable of projecting American air power across hundreds of miles of open ocean. She was commanded at the Battle of Midway by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1912 who had spent decades developing the precise kind of ship handling and aviation operational expertise that carrier command in 1942 demanded. Buckmaster was not a man given to dramatic gestures or theatrical displays of authority. By all contemporary accounts, he was methodical, deeply professional, and possessed of an instinctive understanding of the relationship between aircraft operations and ship survivability that would prove critical in the hours ahead. He commanded a crew of roughly 2,700 officers and enlisted men, a small city's worth of human beings compressed into a steel hull. Living in the peculiar intimacy of warship life, where every man's survival depended on the competence of every other man. Where the distance between a perfectly executed damage control procedure and catastrophic flooding could be measured in seconds, and in the composure of a single petty officer in a flooding compartment deep below the waterline. The strategic context surrounding Midway in early June of 1942 cannot be overstated in its importance, and it must be understood clearly to appreciate what was being asked of the Yorktown and her crew. 6 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had executed its devastating strike against Pearl Harbor, killing 2,403 Americans and crippling the Pacific Fleet's battleship force in a single morning. In the months that followed, Japanese forces had swept through the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed and ferocity that stunned the Allied world. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, all had fallen or were falling. The psychological momentum was entirely with Japan. The United States Navy was on its back foot, operating with damaged infrastructure, shattered morale in some quarters, and an industrial machine that was beginning to mobilize but had not yet produced the torrential output that would eventually overwhelm Japanese production capacity. The Yorktown herself bore the marks of previous combat. At the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, barely 4 weeks before Midway, she had taken a single bomb hit that caused severe internal damage, killed 66 men outright, and left her engineering and structural teams dealing with flooding and fires in her lower decks. The conventional estimate among Japanese naval intelligence was that she would require somewhere between 3 months and 90 days of dry dock repair before she could return to operational service. This assessment was not unreasonable. The damage she had sustained was genuine and significant. But it fatally misled Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his staff as they planned Operation Me, the seizure of Midway Atoll, because they assumed the United States Pacific Fleet would be unable to deploy 3 carriers in response to the attack. They believed they would face 2 carriers at most, if that. They were wrong. When the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz met her personally at the dock. The repair estimate from his engineers was 72 hours. Nimitz looked at the damage, looked at his timeline, and told them they had that exact amount of time. What followed was one of the most remarkable emergency repair operations in naval history. 1,400 workers descending on the wounded carrier around the clock, plugging compartments, shoring up bulkheads, restoring power systems, patching what could be patched, and welding shut what couldn't be fully repaired. On May 30, 1942, 72 hours almost to the minute after arriving at Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown put back out to sea. She was not fully repaired. She was not completely sound. But she was operational. She could recover and launch aircraft, and she could make speed. She steamed northeast to rendezvous with Task Forces 16 and 17 at a point in the Pacific known as Point Luck, a PPROXI MATELY 325 miles northeast of Midway Atoll, where Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the Yorktown took overall tactical command of the assembled American fleet. 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. A force built entirely around the principle that air power, properly employed, could destroy a surface fleet that dwarfed it in terms of raw tonnage and traditional naval firepower. The Japanese force bearing down on Midway was staggering in its scale and complexity. Yamamoto's overall operational plan involved more than 200 ships, including 4 fleet carriers, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Hiryu, Akagi, and the Soryu, whose combined air groups represented the most experienced and battle-hardened carrier aviation force in the world in June of 1942. These were the same carriers, and in many cases, the same aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their dive bomber and torpedo bomber crews had been honed by months of continuous combat operations stretching back through the Dutch East Indies, Ceylon, and the Indian Ocean. They were formidable in a way that statistics alone cannot fully capture. Against this force, the 3 American carriers and their air groups were being asked to do something that had no real precedent: to ambush and destroy a superior enemy fleet through the careful, precise application of intelligence and timing. Striking from a position of concealment before the Japanese could bring their numerical superiority to bear. The intelligence that made this possible had been assembled through one of the most consequential cryptographic achievements of the entire war. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, working in a basement vault under conditions of extreme secrecy and extraordinary intellectual pressure, had broken enough of the Japanese Naval Code. JN 252 determined that the objective of the forthcoming operation was a location designated AF, which Rochefort believed, through a combination of rigorous analysis and inspired deduction, was Midway Atoll. When Washington remained skeptical of this assessment, Rochefort arranged a simple, elegant trap. He had Midway send an unencrypted radio message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Within days, intercepted Japanese naval traffic began referencing a water shortage at AF. The question of the objective was settled. Nimitz could position his carriers with confidence. But positioning with confidence and surviving what came next were 2 entirely different things. And the men aboard the Yorktown, from Captain 9th Buckmaster on the bridge to the youngest aviation ordnanceman working in the hangar bay below the flight deck, had only the dimmest outline of the intelligence picture that had brought them to this particular coordinate in the Pacific. What they knew was simpler and more immediate. They were outnumbered. They were sailing toward a fight, and the ship beneath their feet was still carrying damage from a battle fought less than a month ago. The temporary patches in her lower compartments held pressure that her engineers watched with quiet, professional anxiety. The repair crews at Pearl Harbor had done extraordinary work. But extraordinary work performed in 72 hours under wartime conditions is still work performed against the grain of physical reality. And the men who understood the Yorktown's engineering systems understood, with the particular clarity that comes from technical knowledge, that she was not the ship she had been before the Coral Sea. And yet she steamed northeast toward Point Luck in the pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific. Her flight deck empty and wet with spray. Her crew at their stations or sleeping in their bunks in the brief. Precious intervals between watches, carrying within her steel hull all the accumulated weight of the nation's hopes in the Pacific and all the individual private fears of 2,700 men who had joined the Navy for 1,000 different reasons and found themselves, in the early morning hours of June 1, 1942, converging on a moment that would define the entire arc of the war. The ocean around them was dark and indifferent, stretching to every horizon without a landmark or a reference point. Just the endless gray-green surface of the Pacific rising and falling in long, slow swells beneath a sky that offered no comfort and no answers. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the 4 carriers of the WWII, Japan's elite carrier striking force, were moving toward the same point at speed. Their own crews going through the same rhythms of preparation and waiting. Their own officers studying charts and weather reports and fuel consumption figures, confident in their experience and their numbers and their months of unbroken success. The Yorktown was sailing into the most consequential 3 days in the history of naval aviation. She was sailing into a moment that would cost her everything. And she was sailing there already wounded, already patched, already marked by the particular vulnerability of a ship that has survived one battle and carries the evidence of that survival in her structure and her systems. The men aboard her did not know everything that was coming, but some of them, the experienced ones, the ones who had been at Coral Sea, the ones who understood carrier warfare in their bones, must have sensed something in the quality of the ocean around them in those final quiet days before contact. There is a kind of silence that precedes catastrophic violence, a stillness in which ordinary details acquire an unusual sharpness and clarity, as though the mind is filing them away against some future need. The sound of aircraft engines being run up in the hangar bay, the smell of coffee and aviation fuel, the particular way the flight deck vibrated underfoot when the ship was pushing through a moderate sea at high speed. The Yorktown was alive in all the ways that matter most, and she was about to prove it in ways that would astonish everyone who witnessed what she endured, and break the hearts of everyone who watched her finally go down.